It is not only about minimum wage. While our nation might have been able to move on from slavery and unpaid labor through federal policies such as minimum wage, those same federal policies simply do not work to address modern-day issues such as poverty. Rather than actually addressing the issue, minimum wage simply redistributes the same amount of money amongst low-wage workers without actually doing anything about poverty. We need new and comprehensive measures that will address the problem while building off of minimum wage, because while minimum wage might have fixed enslavement to companies and corporations nearly a century ago, it hasn't and won't fix enslavement to poverty. Minimum wage is a federal policy that impacts every American, from the price we pay for goods and services to the income of 1.6 million American workers and their families. Since it is so impactful, it should be effective, yet it isn't. While it might have solved the issue of unpaid labor nearly a century ago, those same federal policies simply don't work to solve modern-day problems in our society like poverty. Minimum wage was introduced in 1938 when Congress passed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was introduced by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. This was introduced in response to the fact that companies were underpaying and exploiting unskilled workers, which at the time were mostly women and children. This practically unpaid labor was borderline slavery. The first federal minimum wage was 25 cents, which isn't much, but it was much more than most people were making back then. To better understand how minimum wage affects us as a society, I conducted interviews with 10 everyday members of American society. 5 of my interviewees were students, and 5 of my interviewees were their parents. Their knowledge and experience are the foundation of this documentary. I first asked them what thoughts they had on minimum wage, and if they believed that minimum wage affected them.
It has.
Yes or no?
I would say not so much now, but certainly when I was younger.
I think it impacts everybody's life.
It probably would have affected me when I was with my first job.
No, at the moment.
Minimum wage does impact my life.
I think it impacts everybody's lives, just in different ways.
No.
Yes, it does, because I had a job.
In a couple of years when I start working minimum wage jobs, it will be impacting my life greatly.
But it doesn't affect my life too drastically just because of my parents. I'm still under their roof.
I grew up working minimum wage jobs.
It's going to affect me in the way that there's a possibilities that prices may rise.
While it might have solved the issue of unpaid labor nearly a century ago, it hasn't and will not solve the current day issue of poverty. I asked the same group of people if they believed that minimum wage was effective.
Yes. Yes.
No.
Yes.
Yes.
No.
No.
I will have to go say no.
Yes.
If there wasn't that requirement to have someone pay, then businesses could exploit workers.
It honestly depends if you're providing for a family or just providing for yourself, because they're two very different stories.
I don't think really that the concept of just a universal minimum wage is really that much of a good idea.
I think we're saying like the idea works, but like the logistics of it sometimes doesn't.
So I didn't realize it when I was young, but I grew up poor. So I worked because I had to. It's not enough. Minimum wage is not to survive.
Minimum wage increases just causes more unemployment. There's fewer jobs, so some people just go from minimum wage to zero. So on net, the research shows that minimum wage actually decreases family incomes.
As was stated, minimum wage helps prevent companies from grossly underpaying their workers. However, it is not a solution that allows any American to rise out of poverty. One main reason is because it is a one-size-fits-all policy.
I hope that if Congress is going to take this up, that they'll be making similar considerations about geographic discrepancies, right? $15 in New York is a lot different than, $15 in my home state of Oklahoma.
A single parent with 2 or more kids earning minimum wage is considered below the poverty line, which shows that minimum wage really isn't efficient at raising low-wage workers out of poverty. While the original purpose of minimum wage might have been to end practically unpaid labor, the only fathomable reason it could still be an argument could be to raise low-wage workers out of poverty.
So there's a pretty good study done by the University of Washington last year that looked at Seattle's increase of its minimum wage and found that although employment itself didn't necessarily decline, What actually declined was the number of hours that minimum wage workers were scheduled. So a 9% drop in hours on average resulted in workers on average taking home $125 less a week.
The reason that no one can agree on a fair minimum wage is because there is no fair minimum wage. Minimum wage on its own simply cannot solve complex societal problems such as poverty. However, a fair minimum wage can be found when paired with governmental policies and programs such as affordable healthcare and education that specifically benefit low-income workers, while simultaneously implementing federal policies and incentives that make it more economical for a business to pay their workers a fair living wage. No policy or program can be completely effective on its own, but what makes America truly powerful is when these federal and state policies and programs combine with American entrepreneurship and innovation to create a truly successful nation where anyone can accomplish their goals.